Hi, I hope everyone's doing well, all things considered. This talk will be about the Walker Robot Dog in VR demo. I'm Nick Rukowski, and my advisor for this project is Professor Ming Lin. So let's get started. This is the SIGGRAPH recording policy that they ask you to follow. Feel free to read it, but it basically asks you to not record these talks, and they should be available after the conference. You can also contact me directly with questions. Here's an overview of our talk. I'll start with motivation and background, especially with respect to redirected walking and distractors. Then I'll talk about our own work, then our current results and a discussion about them, and finally I'll describe the demo and point you to their downloads. So to motivate this project, we look at the issue of training populations that require extensive practical experience to succeed. For example, visually impaired or autistic children, who usually require a specialist to train them in person to build various skills such as mental mapping, or the elderly, who are often at risk for plenty of reasons. COVID-19 is a relevant example for this problem since we must limit in-person contact anyway. But even before this, it seems like there should be a safe way to train these groups from the comfort of their own homes, such as through VR. In our previous work, we wanted to see if blinded users could navigate a VR simulation with the help of something like a virtual guide dog. These users were blinded, as in they're not actually blind, but we didn't show anything on the VR headset. They only had 3D audio. We found that they can make it through a number of scenarios, such as an empty living room, a fire drill scenario in which they press buttons on a wall, and a traffic simulation with moving cars and pedestrians. Their performance wasn't even that much worse than the groups that did have vision. We could even navigate them around obstacles. The technique we used for this will be explained soon, but some limitations we found were that the dog was too annoying and unnatural, its behavior was a bit inconsistent and inefficient, so basically it wasn't smart or believable enough, and the groups that did have vision just stopped following directions. So for this new project we ask, how can we improve such a virtual guide dog? Before we get into our own work, I'll explain some background that we expand upon. A problem with VR locomotion in general is that we only have so much space to dedicate to walking around physically in VR, even though walking naturally is the most preferable way to navigate. There are solutions that avoid natural walking entirely, like teleporting, but these will rarely feel immersive, but they're good enough for things like games. One solution that was proposed in 2001 was redirected walking, in which the virtual environment rotates slower or faster than the user's own rotations, such as their head or eye rotation. The standard limit that we can distort the rotation is up to 30% of the user's head rotational velocity. The distortion causes the user to walk in an arc when they think they're walking in a line, and I'll show a video of this in the next slide. This distortion is considered continuous and subtle because the distortion is always happening as long as the user is rotating, and the user shouldn't realize that it's happening, and they also shouldn't need to do anything manually to get it to happen. There are various flavors of this rotational distortion, such as steer to center, which tries to make the user face the middle of their safe physical environment, which would be the longest continuously walkable space. This is a pretty generic default method that doesn't assume anything about the virtual environment. Steer to orbit tries to get them to walk in a circle around the center, which is often their behavior anyway, if they're walking virtually in a line. Then there are more complicated methods like model predictive control, which use a predictive graph to decide where to rotate the user. So for example, the user probably won't intentionally walk through a wall in VR, so we can just rotate them away from it. Here's the original 2001 redirected walking video, and I'll just show you some parts. Here they show that when the users are asked to walk back and forth while there's some distortion, they walk in a star pattern instead. Then here's the part where they show the distortion happening as the user walks and rotates their head. Notice the arc that they walk in when they virtually walk in a line. Also notice that the most extreme rotations occur when they're looking around. The next important piece of background is on distractors. Redirected walking's main limitation is that if we do stay under the safe distortion threshold, the user needs to rotate their head a lot to get the required rotation. It actually requires at least a 6 by 6 meter play space for redirected walking to work without anything to cause the user to rotate their head if they're walking in a line in something like an open virtual environment. The solution here is reorientation, which is required when continuous redirection fails. One type of reorientation is a hard reset, when the user is physically brought back to the physical environment center by the study administrator. This is the worst case scenario and should only be done if there is something like a hardware failure. Then there's explicit reorientation, such as 2-1 turn, when we ask the user to rotate 360 degrees, but due to distortion they virtually turn 360 but physically turn 180, thus making them face the physical environment center. This is still fairly intrusive and immersion breaking, although it's often good enough. Then we have distractors. These cause the user to look at something that causes the required rotation. Previous work used floating spheres which moved back and forth, butterflies, hummingbirds, a dragon that the user would fight with a water pistol, and then we had our robot dog from before. Some important technical factors to consider are when to start and end the distraction, and what the distractor should do as a distraction, and when it doesn't need to distract anymore. Note that redirection and distraction are typically independent techniques, from a technical standpoint. To reiterate some problems that I noted before, distractors are usually not effective enough, or just unnatural and don't blend into the simulation well. Often they appear sporadically, or they're just static when not distracting. For example, the dragon from before just sits on a perch when it's not distracting. They're also usually annoying and repetitive due to their limited and predictable behaviors. Finally, they take up too much of the simulation. The state of the art is about 50% of the entire simulation spent acknowledging the distractor, which is a lot. Another limitation is that trigger conditions are too simplistic. Typically, we see some form of the user is looking in or out of bounds, which becomes unstable if the user is just glancing around. We noticed in our own work that blinded users like to look around to localize audio sources, so they would have rapid head movement like this, and that would suddenly trigger a distraction because they decided to look this way for just a split second. We also see a test of the user's distance from the physical environment center, so how far are they from the middle of the space. However, what if they were already reoriented and they're looking in the center of the physical environment, but they haven't had a chance to walk back yet? There are so many edge cases, and human randomness is not accounted for, which causes very unstable distractions. A limitation to the efficiency of the distraction is that, as mentioned before, redirection is decoupled from distraction, but it probably shouldn't be. For example, we can probably assume that the user will look at the distractor during a distraction, if the distractor is actually effective enough at grabbing their attention. So finally, our goal is to create a distractor that can easily grab and hold the user's attention, while being efficient, meaning it spends a minimal amount of time distracting, natural, meaning that it's not obvious that it's trying to distract you, and well integrated into the scene, meaning that it makes sense for the distractor to be in that scene. Now we finally get to our own work. We created a persistent haptic distractor in response to those problems. A persistent distractor is a well-integrated and natural part of the scenario that's always there, actively doing something, whether they're distracting or not. The haptic part comes in the form of reciprocal haptic feedback to better drive the user's interaction with the distractor and to make the distractor more effective due to being more easily noticed, since most people would notice a pull much faster than they would notice something in their peripherals. Our target scenario is walking a dog to the park, so the user holds a leash that's attached to a physical robot distractor, while that same robot appears to be a puppy in the virtual scene itself. We also make optimizations to the steer-to-sensor and distractor algorithms. So we make more robust start and end conditions for the distractor, we give it more complex behaviors and distractions, and finally, we use the distractor's trajectory to determine which way to distort the user's rotation. We also find some other interesting side effects, such as the physical leash that tethers the human and robot actually makes it easier to predict the user's movement, since we know that most people are going to try to make sure the leash is not tangled around their legs. Also, since the distractor is now a physical object as well as a virtual one, its trajectory is also distorted by redirection. Our distractor now has actions for when it is or isn't distracting. When it's not distracting, it's being a good dog and just walking in front of the user. When it is distracting, it finds a point to visit, it goes there, then it distracts based on the context. So if it decides to go to a hydrant, then it'll sniff it, or it can eat food off the floor, or it can bark at someone. Here's a visual of how we choose a distraction point. We first see if it's safe for the robot to just go to the physical center, since that's where the user should ideally look anyway. We shoot a ray in that direction to make sure that there doesn't happen to be a building or some object at that point, so the robot doesn't go through a wall or something like that. Then we shoot a sphere around there to see if there's an object of interest nearby. And if there is, then we'll use that. Otherwise, we'll just use whatever non-interesting point we found before. Here's our prototype. We modified a four-wheeled robot from Amazon that we fit with a Bluetooth adapter so it can communicate with the game engine that runs the VR simulation. The robot and the leash both have a Vive Tracker 2.0, which lets us track them without a more complicated method like SLAM in the same space as the VR headset. We have a leash that's mostly a spring connecting a leash handle and the robot, and we added a lead block to the center of the robot to make it harder to displace and easier to rotate. The leash is retractable just so that we can adjust it slightly depending on the user's height. As for how the robot moves, we use differential drive mechanics to navigate a four-wheeled robot by creating a circle with the Vive Tracker data. The minor arc of the circle would be the ideal trajectory for the robot. Then we use the differential drive equations to get wheel velocities that tell it how to move along that arc. More detail can be found in robotics literature, and you can also dig into this figure. We also have a state machine describing the distractor's behavior, with extra behaviors that account for a physical robot. For example, the robot always adjusts itself away from the user so that it doesn't get kicked or get stuck under their legs. I recommend looking at the paper for more details. The scenario is a big city, aesthetically similar to something like Chicago. The park that the user is walking to is a few blocks away from where they spawn. They can reach it however they wish, but the dog must come with them. There's also a music festival occurring, so all of the buildings are blasting music, pedestrians are walking on the street, playing different audio cues and avoiding each other, as naturally as is possible in real time. There are also no cars as a result of the festival. There's a navigation mesh that constrains where the pedestrians and distractor can go. For example, they can't walk through buildings or walls. The entire simulation is built with Unreal Engine 4. Here's a summary of our current findings, with more quantitative results found in the paper. We did a kind of pseudo-synthetic validation with highly randomized virtual users that behave similarly to our real users from our previous work. We found that the new start conditions interacted with the end conditions to improve distractor efficiency, but they didn't do much by themselves. The end conditions made a big difference and considerably stabilized the distractor behavior, causing individual distractions to be longer, but with much fewer of them. The deterministic steer-to-sensor rotation completely eliminated the need for resets. Thus, we believe that the new methods are required for a persistent robot distractor to work, since an unstable robot would make distractions very noticeable in a bad way, and it would also be very frustrating for the user. Through many informal tests, we find that haptics decreases the user's response time significantly. A smooth robot trajectory is important for immersion, since twitchiness is very evident with the haptics, but having the trajectory be perfect is not as important because the spring leash obscures some of the feeling. And finally, the tethering with the leash is a good natural limiter for human trajectory. Due to COVID-19, we can't physically demo this, but we provide a few different ways of experiencing a version of it yourself. We'll have binaries that should work on your own PC VR device or an Oculus Quest. We'll also provide a desktop version that lets you be a first-person character, or you can just have an aerial view of the character. This is the same distractor, just without the physical robot. Think of it like the best behaved distractor possible. The binaries and more information can be found at this link. Enjoy, and thanks for watching.